Welcome to Voices from Forgotten Souls, the place where we bring hidden stories of the past into the light. Before we begin this powerful true story from the island of Guadeloupe, kindly tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time of day you joined us. If you have not subscribed, kindly do so now, and like this video so others can find it. Watch to the very end, because what you are about to hear is a tale of mystery, courage, fear, and revenge. A story that history tried to bury in silence, but today we will let the forgotten speak again. The night wind moved softly through the sugarcane fields of the plantation known as La Grande Savane, a place where tall green stalks whispered secrets that no human voice dared speak aloud. In those days, during the early years of the 19th century, when the island struggled under the tight grip of slave masters who ruled with iron chains and unending cruelty, the field hands lived in fear of the overseers who carried whips, pistols, and hatred in their hearts. The plantation was owned by the notorious Laurent family, known across the island for punishments so cruel that even other slave owners whispered about them behind closed doors. Among the hundreds of enslaved people forced to work under the burning sun was a young woman named Zabeth, a woman who had learned long ago that silence was the only shield that protected the lives of the enslaved. Zabeth kept her head low, moved quickly, worked quietly, and never looked directly into the eyes of an overseer. People believed she was shy and fearful, yet inside her heart burned a fire hotter than the tropical sun that shone over the endless fields. No one knew her secret, and no one guessed that this quiet young woman carried a rage deeper than the ocean that surrounded the island. Zabeth had been brought to La Grande Savane when she was around 14 years old. She remembered the day clearly, even though she never spoke of it. The overseer named Baptiste, a large man with a crooked smile and eyes that could freeze the soul, had dragged her from the wagon and pushed her straight into the cane fields without food or rest. On that same day, she watched her only brother, a boy named Etienne, beaten nearly to death for refusing to leave her side. After the beating ended, Etienne never walked the same again. His back healed in twisted scars, and the pain in his leg never left him. The overseers teased him by calling him one leg, even though both legs were intact. Zabeth never forgot the way her brother lay bleeding on the dusty ground, while Baptiste laughed and wiped sweat from his forehead. She never forgot the way the sun made the blood on his shirt shine like dark fire. From that moment, revenge took root in her heart. She was only a child, but she made a promise that one day she would make the overseers pay for what they did to her brother. But revenge takes patience, especially for a slave. A slave has no weapons, no voice, no freedom to plan or act boldly. So Zabeth learned to wait. She watched every routine, every shift change, every weak point in the plantation's structure. She learned which overseers were drunk at night, which ones were cruel, which ones could not resist the temptation of silence or shadows. And she waited for the moment when the cane fields would whisper her name. Years passed. Zabeth grew into a strong and determined woman whose quiet face hid a powerful mind. Her brother struggled daily with pain, but he remained alive, and Zabeth took every chance to protect him. The overseers thought she was harmless, a girl too frightened to fight back. But that belief was exactly what Zabeth wanted them to think. Every night, she sat outside their hut, listening to the wind move through the fields like a living spirit. The other enslaved people spoke often about how spirits lived in the tall cane, how the wind carried the memory of the dead, how every stalk held stories of those who could not speak anymore. Zabeth believed these whispers. Sometimes she even felt the wind call her name, soft and gentle, as if urging her to rise. The cruelty of the plantation worsened with each year. Baptiste grew more violent, and new overseers joined him, each trying to outdo the others in brutality. The worst among them was a man named Rue, whose favorite punishment was to tie people to the whipping post for the smallest mistakes. Rue once whipped a 12-year-old boy for dropping a bucket of water. He once beat a pregnant woman until she fainted. The enslaved people feared him more than darkness itself. Yet even Rue did not know that Zabeth had begun quietly gathering a small circle of trusted people who had also tasted pain too bitter to forget. They were not warriors. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary men and women who wanted justice and freedom in any form they could take it. The first person she confided in was her brother, Etienne, who at first refused. He feared that Zabeth's plan would cost her life, but Zabeth told him with calm conviction that living in silence was no different from death, and that sometimes a soul must choose to rise, even when rising is dangerous. Etienne finally agreed. Their small circle grew slowly. A quiet man named Marcel, whose sister had been killed by the overseers. A woman named Adeline, who survived an assault, but lost her husband when he tried to protect her. A field hand named Joachim, who had seen more cruelty in his 30 years than any man deserved. They all listened to Zabeth as she spoke in whispers under moonlight, her voice steady, her eyes focused on something far beyond fear. She told them that revenge was not anger, but justice, and justice was something the enslaved were denied every day. She told them that she believed the spirits of the cane fields would protect them, for they were fighting for every soul that had ever been beaten, broken, or buried without a name. Her followers began calling her the Spirit Listener, believing she could hear ancient voices that guided her path. Zabeth did not encourage the title, but she also did not deny it. The night that changed everything came in the late season, when the cane stalks grew tall and sharp under the pale moon. The sky was clear and still, except for the occasional rustling of leaves that carried a sense of anticipation. On that night, Zabeth watched as Baptiste struck a young girl for working too slowly. The girl fell to the ground, crying. Baptiste lifted his whip again, but something in Zabeth snapped. She felt the wind shift sharply, as if the spirits themselves gasped in anger. She stepped forward without thinking, grabbing the whip mid-air. Baptiste stared at her in shock, because Zabeth had never acted out before. His face twisted with rage, and he pushed her so harsh she fell into the sugar cane. But as she fell, Zabeth saw something she had never seen before. She saw the overseer Rue watching from a distance, with a strange smile. A smile that carried a message she could not yet understand. The girl on the ground sobbed quietly. Baptiste kicked dust at her and walked away. But that single moment became the spark that lit the fire within Zabeth completely. She rose from the ground, her hands shaking, her heart pounding like drums. She knew then that waiting was over. The time for revenge had finally arrived. That night, Zabeth called her circle together. They sat in silence behind the workers' huts, hidden by shadows and tall grass. The moon hung above them like a silent witness. Zabeth spoke softly, but firmly. She told them the time had come to end the torment brought by the overseers. She told them that unless they acted, more children would be beaten, more families destroyed, and more lives crushed without mercy. She said she had listened long enough, waited long enough, and suffered long enough. She declared that the overseers believed the enslaved were weak, but the cane fields held memories of every injustice, and that the spirits within the wind would rise with them. She explained that she had studied the overseers closely for many years. She knew their paths, their routines, and the places where they were vulnerable. She knew that Baptiste often patrolled near the barns alone in the late hours, while Rue drank heavily behind the plantation house before staggering into the fields. She knew the weaknesses of each one, and she believed they could strike with precision and disappear into the shadows before dawn. Some members of her group trembled with fear. Others felt a spark ignite inside them. Zabeth looked at each face one by one. She reminded them that fear was natural, but silence was deadly. She reminded them that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for those who had died without justice, for those who could no longer speak. She told them that if they succeeded, the overseers would understand that the enslaved were not powerless. Her voice carried a strange calmness that made even the skeptical ones listen more closely. When she finished speaking, the group sat in a long silence. The moon hung low, and the sound of night insects filled the air. Finally, Etienne nodded slowly, placing his hand on the ground as if listening to the heartbeat of the earth. He said the time felt right. One by one, the others agreed, until the circle was united. Zabeth closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered her final plan to them. The cane fields rustled softly, as if approval drifted through the wind. That was the night the plot for revenge was born. And though the group was small, their anger was large. Though their hands were empty, their spirits were full. Though the overseers believed the enslaved were powerless, they would soon learn that even quiet souls can rise with thunder. And Zabeth, the woman who once hid her fire behind silence, became the leader of a plan that would shake the plantation in ways it had never seen before. The rising sun stretched across La Grande Savane like a fiery curtain, casting long shadows over the sugarcane field that swayed in the warm Caribbean wind. Zabeth moved carefully as she worked with the others, pretending to be focused solely on the cutting of cane. Yet her thoughts were far from the task. Her mind was on the meeting from the night before, when she and her small circle agreed to take the first steps toward revenge. Every motion she made was calm on the outside, but inside, her heart pulsed with the weight of their decision. She watched the overseers walk past, their boots tossing up dust with every step. Baptiste shouted orders as usual, and Rue walked with his stick tapping against the ground. Zabeth looked at their movements closely, noticing details she had memorized over the years. The way Baptiste tapped his whip against his thigh. The way Rue constantly checked his pistol, but never properly secured it. These small observations became the foundation of her growing plan. Though she continued her duties without hesitation, she felt the cane fields whisper again, urging her to stay focused, to remain patient, and to trust the path she had chosen. She kept her hands steady, even as her thoughts raced like a river after rainfall. By midday, the sun grew harsher, making sweat drip into her eyes as she worked. The overseers' tempers flared easily under the heat. Baptiste shouted at one of the younger boys for dropping cane stalks. Rue struck a man across the back for pausing to drink water. Zabeth felt anger rising again, but she controlled it. She had promised herself she would not act impulsively. Her revenge had to be precise and powerful. As she bent down to gather fallen stalks, she noticed Etienne limping nearby, struggling with each step. The sight tightened something deep within her chest. She remembered how he had once been the one who protected her, shielded her, tried to take blows meant for her when they first arrived on the plantation. Now, she was the one preparing to protect him. When she looked up, she saw Rue smirking at Etienne's slow movement, a smirk filled with cruelty. For a moment, she imagined striking him right there in the open, but she took a slow breath and reminded herself that their time would come soon, but not yet. What she needed now was calmness to gather information. As she worked, she noticed something different. A new overseer had arrived that morning. His name was Gerard, a tall man with a thick beard and a cold stare. Unlike the others, he walked silently, observing the workers without speaking much. Zabeth watched him closely. His silence worried her. She wondered if he would be more dangerous than the others, because men who watched too much and spoke too little often carried secrets. When the sun began to set, the workers were finally allowed to return to their huts. Zabeth waited until the overseers had walked out of sight before joining her group at their secret meeting place behind the huts, where the ground dipped slightly and hid them from view. The evening air carried a heavy stillness, broken only by the distant hum of insects. Zabeth greeted her circle with a nod. They sat close together, forming a tight shape of shadows within shadows. She began by describing the overseer's movements that day, explaining the schedule Baptiste followed, and the places where Rue wandered when he drank too much. She explained how Baptiste often visited the barns alone at the same hour every night. She explained how Rue always walked toward the far edges of the field after drinking. Then she spoke about Gerard, the newcomer. She said he troubled her because of his silence and the way he studied the workers. She said they must be cautious because Gerard might sense something before they acted. The group listened with full attention. Marcel clenched his fists as he spoke of the years of torment the overseers had put them through. Adeline whispered that she dreamed of seeing the overseers fall. Joachim said he would do whatever Zabeth asked. Yet, despite their agreement, fear lingered heavily. Many wondered how they could succeed with bare hands against armed overseers. Zabeth let them express their fears, and then leaned closer, her voice low but steady. She told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear control the heart. She said she believed the spirits of the cane fields would protect them, for their cause was righteous. The night grew darker, and the moon climbed higher. Zabeth then revealed the second phase of her plan. She explained that they would not strike all overseers at once. Instead, they would begin with Baptiste, because he walked alone at night and trusted no one. She said Baptiste believed the enslaved feared him too much to ever strike back, which made him vulnerable. She described the path he always took near the barns, and how they could use the shadows to their advantage. She said they needed to study the barn area closely, count every step, every corner, every hiding spot. She told them they would watch for several nights before taking action. The group nodded, agreeing that patience would be their greatest weapon. Then she added something that made everyone silent. She said that Baptiste carried a pistol, but she had seen him drop it once in the dirt, and she believed he did not know how to aim properly. She said a man who holds a weapon with no respect for it cannot use it well. This gave the group new confidence. Etienne placed his hand gently on Zabeth's shoulder, telling her she was brave. But Zabeth shook her head gently and said she was not brave. She was simply tired of suffering. The meeting ended quietly as they slipped back into their huts, one by one, like shadows disappearing into the night. As Zabeth lay down on her thin mat, she stared at the ceiling and listened as the wind rustled the cane outside. She felt as if the spirits whispered to her again, telling her she had taken the first step on a dangerous road. She whispered back that she was ready. And when she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed of the cane fields moving like an ocean, each stalk bending toward her, as if acknowledging her rising strength. Night settled over La Grande Savane like a heavy blanket. The stars scattered above, like silent witnesses to secrets unfolding below. Zabeth stepped quietly from her hut after everyone appeared asleep, though she knew her small circle was waiting for a signal. She did not tap on doors or whisper to wake anyone. She simply moved into the night with calm steps, trusting her group to join her one by one. The moon was only a thin sliver, shining a soft light across the cane fields and barns. Zabeth walked toward the edge of the workers' huts, crouching low behind a thick clump of grass. Slowly, Marcel, Adeline, Joachim, and Etienne appeared behind her, their faces tense but determined. No words were spoken. They all knew speaking was too dangerous. Sounds traveled too easily on the plantation at night, especially near the barns, where Baptiste often patrolled with his whip hanging at his side. Zabeth pointed toward the barns, then motioned for them to stay low. The group crawled forward silently, using the tall grass as a shield. From where they hid, they could observe the area Baptiste always crossed during his late evening rounds. The barn sat like two large shadows, with small lanterns glowing faintly near the entrances. Zabeth studied every corner of the structure. She counted the crates stacked near the side walls. She counted the steps between the barns and the fence. She watched the dirt path Baptiste usually took. Most importantly, she watched the blind spots where no lantern light reached. Each detail settled into her mind like pieces of a puzzle. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with focus. She felt the wind brushing gently against her face, as if reminding her that this path was chosen long ago. After several minutes, the faint sound of boots scraping the dirt reached their ears. Baptiste emerged from behind one of the barns, walking exactly where Zabeth expected him to be. He held a lantern in one hand and his whip in the other, moving with the confidence of a man who believed no one dared challenge him. The group stayed perfectly still. Baptiste walked past the crates and stood for a moment, staring toward the fields, perhaps listening for signs of runaway workers. Zabeth's eyes followed every movement he made. She saw how he placed his lantern on a crate for a moment as he stretched his neck. She saw how he tilted his head from side to side, cracking his stiff muscles. These small habits mattered. Small habits created openings. When Baptiste lifted the lantern again, he shook it slightly, as if irritated by the dim light. Then he continued walking, but Zabeth noticed something unusual. He paused near the second barn and looked behind him. His expression changed. It became serious, almost suspicious, as if he sensed something in the air. Zabeth felt her heart tighten. She glanced at her group and signaled for them to remain completely still. Baptiste stared into the darkness for several seconds, his eyes squinting. Then finally he shrugged and continued his round. Only after he walked far enough away did Zabeth release a slow breath. She realized how close they came to being discovered. She understood now that even though Baptiste was careless and cruel, he was not entirely foolish. A man who had survived years of hunting runaways had some instincts. She knew their plan had to be executed with precision. Carelessness could destroy everything. When Baptiste finally disappeared toward the far side of the plantation, Zabeth nodded to her group, and they quietly retreated into the grass. They crawled back toward the huts, moving as slowly as possible so the shifting grass did not reveal their presence. Once they reached the protective shadows of the huts, the group gathered close. Joachim whispered that he feared Baptiste almost saw them. Adeline admitted her heart nearly stopped beating when he stared into the darkness. Marcel asked whether they should postpone their plan. Zabeth listened to each one carefully before speaking. Her voice remained calm. She said that Baptiste sensed something because the spirits in the wind were restless. She said the cane fields carried memories of past suffering, and sometimes those memories rose with intensity when justice approached. She told them not to fear the overseer's instincts, because they were stronger than he knew. She reminded them that she had watched Baptiste for years. She knew his habits better than he knew them himself. She told the group that the moment of danger they experienced tonight was only a reminder that they must remain cautious and patient. She asked them to trust her judgment. She said they were not yet ready to strike, but they were close. Etienne watched his sister with pride in his eyes. He told the group that Zabeth had more wisdom than any of them, and he believed she would guide them safely through this dangerous path. The others nodded slowly, finding comfort in the determination in her voice. Zabeth told them that tomorrow they would continue studying Baptiste's movements. She said they needed to watch him again and again until his routine became predictable. Only then would they strike. The group agreed. They slipped quietly back to their huts and tried to sleep, though their minds were filled with thoughts of what awaited them. The following morning began like any other. The rising sun spilled across the plantation, touching every corner with bright golden light. Yet something in the air felt different. Even the birds seemed quieter. Zabeth walked into the cane fields with her group and began working. She noticed Baptiste watching the workers with more suspicion than usual. Rue barked orders loudly, annoyed by the shift in Baptiste's mood. Gerard, the silent newcomer, stood with his arms crossed near the storeroom, watching everyone with sharp eyes. Zabeth moved with care. She could not afford to draw suspicion. As she cut cane stalks, she spoke quietly to Etienne when no overseer was near. She told him that Baptiste's changed mood worried her. She said they must be even more careful now. Etienne agreed, reminding her that the overseers were unpredictable, and that one mistake could cost many lives. Later in the afternoon, Zabeth noticed that Gerard kept glancing toward her. His stare was not cruel like Rue's or mocking like Baptiste's. Instead, it was calculating, as if he studied the way she moved. She pretended not to see him, but inside she felt uneasy. Why was he watching her so closely? Did he sense something? Or was he simply trying to understand the workers? She could not tell. But one thing was clear. Gerard was becoming a problem. When the workday ended, Zabeth gathered her group again behind the huts. She told them about Gerard's watchful eyes. Marcel said he did not trust Gerard because men who stare quietly often hide something dark. Adeline wondered if Gerard had been warned that workers were planning something. Joachim asked if they should target Gerard first, but Zabeth shook her head. She told them that Gerard was dangerous because they did not understand him. She said it was wiser to watch him before making any decisions. Then she revealed something that caught everyone's breath. She said that the timing might need to move faster. She explained that Baptiste's suspicious behavior meant that waiting too long could raise more red flags. She said that the cane fields whispered to her earlier in the day, urging her to prepare quickly. She told them that within a few nights, they must be ready. The group stayed silent, fully aware of the weight of her words. As darkness returned to the plantation, Zabeth slipped out once more, but this time alone. She needed to feel the night without the presence of others. She needed to listen more carefully to the spirits she believed guided her. She walked to the edge of the cane fields, letting her fingers slide along the leaves. The night air felt heavy and warm. She closed her eyes and listened. The wind whispered softly at first, then grew stronger. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, like a pull. She followed that feeling deeper into the field. There she stopped and looked up at the stars. She whispered that she was ready, but she needed the spirits to help her protect her people. She asked for strength. She asked for clarity. She asked for courage. The wind responded with a long sigh that carried through the cane like a living voice. She felt the earth beneath her feet vibrating softly. When she opened her eyes again, she felt more certain than ever. She walked back to the huts with steady steps. She knew now that the time for revenge was coming fast. She knew Baptiste would soon face the justice he had escaped for many years. She knew Rue would follow. She knew Gerard would have to be dealt with. She knew danger lay in every direction, but she felt no fear. She felt purpose. And as she lay on her mat that night, staring into the darkness, she whispered a promise. She said that the overseers who brought suffering to so many would soon meet the shadows they created. She said the cane fields would no longer stand silent. She said justice would rise from the earth like fire. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to prepare her mind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow Baptiste would walk his rounds again. Tomorrow her group would watch more carefully than ever, and soon, very soon, the first strike would fall, changing the fate of La Grande Savane forever. The following day began with a heavy sky, as if the island itself sensed the tension waiting to unfold. The clouds hung low over La Grande Savane, casting a dull gray light across the sugar-cane fields. Zabeth left her hut with calm steps, though her heart carried the weight of many decisions. She walked into the cane fields with the same quiet expression she always wore, blending in among the workers as though nothing was different. But inside, she felt the ground shifting, as though destiny had begun to move beneath her feet. The overseers walked among the workers with suspicious eyes. Baptiste seemed restless, snapping his whip against the ground for no reason other than to make people tremble. Rue shouted at a young man for walking too slowly, insulting him until he nearly cried. Gerard watched everything silently, his cold stare moving from one person to another, making Zabeth feel as though he saw more than he should. She told herself to remain steady. Today was not the day to act, but today would give them the final clarity they needed. The group had agreed to study Baptiste one last time before striking. So Zabeth worked while her eyes watched everything around her. She noticed how Baptiste wiped his forehead more often under the thick heat. She noticed he walked heavier than usual, as if tired. She wondered if age was creeping into him after so many years of cruelty. She noticed that Gerard kept glancing toward the barns, as if curious about Baptiste's night rounds. The cane fields whispered softly as the wind blew through them. Zabeth understood their message. She whispered back silently, promising she would not fail. Later in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A sudden storm began forming in the distance, dark clouds rolling in quickly from the sea. The workers exchanged nervous looks. Storms often changed the routines of the plantation, and Zabeth worried that the shift in weather would disrupt her plans. Baptiste shouted for the workers to finish the last row as the wind grew stronger. The workers hurried. Zabeth kept glancing at the barns, watching the path Baptiste usually walked at night. The storm made everything unpredictable. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, turning the dirt into thick mud. The overseers rushed to gather tools and drive workers back to the huts. Rue cursed loudly as the rain soaked his clothes. Gerard moved quickly toward the main house, but before entering, he paused and looked straight at Zabeth. The rain fell across his face, but his stare remained sharp. Zabeth felt something in her chest tighten. She looked away quickly, pretending to struggle with her basket of cane. But Gerard did not move. He watched her for several seconds, then finally turned away. When Zabeth returned to the huts, she found Etienne waiting inside their small room, drenched and shivering slightly. He asked whether they should postpone their plan. Zabeth shook her head slowly. She told him the storm was a sign that the spirits were restless. She said they must act soon, but not tonight. Tonight they needed rest and clarity. She said tomorrow night would be their moment, because storms always confused the overseers and made them sleep heavier from drinking. Etienne looked uneasy, but he trusted her decision. When the rain finally stopped near midnight, Zabeth slipped outside and stood alone under the dripping eaves of the hut. She listened to the cane fields swaying in the wind. She whispered that tomorrow justice would rise. She whispered that Baptiste would not see another sunrise, and the wind seemed to hum back in agreement. The next day, the air was thick with humidity after the storm. The ground remained muddy, making movement slower throughout the plantation. Yet the overseers were in worse condition. Rue walked with a sour expression, complaining loudly that his joints hurt from the cold rain. Baptiste looked tired, his eyes puffy from a night of drinking. Gerard looked less alert than usual, as if the storm had interrupted his sleep. Zabeth noticed every detail. She felt the spirits lifting her heart. She sensed the moment approaching, like a tide pulling the shore. She worked quietly beside Adeline, who whispered nervously that she felt sick with fear. Zabeth placed a gentle hand on her arm and told her to breathe slowly. She told her that fear was natural before a storm of change. She reminded her that they were fighting for their lives and the lives of those who suffered under the overseers. Adeline nodded and returned to work with trembling hands. As the day passed, Zabeth studied Baptiste carefully. She saw how often he rubbed his neck. She saw how clumsy his steps were. She saw how he winced when he lifted his whip. She recognized this as the perfect time. When the workday ended, the workers returned to the huts. Zabeth gathered her group quietly behind the old mango tree near the edge of the workers' quarters. The tree sheltered them from the moonlight and from the eyes of anyone walking near the huts. Zabeth stood before them, her posture calm, her voice steady. She told them that tonight they would strike, The group became silent, every heart pounding loudly. Marcel swallowed hard before asking if they were truly ready. Zabeth nodded. She said they had watched enough, studied enough, prepared enough. She said that hesitation would only bring danger. She explained that Baptiste was weak, tired, careless, and predictable. She said they would lure him behind the barns, where the shadows were thick and the lantern light dim. She said Joachim would make a noise near the corner. She said Baptiste would follow as he always did. She said Marcel and Etienne would strike first. Then she would finish it herself. Adeline asked what they should do if Gerard or Roux came near. Zabeth shook her head. She said she did not think they would. She said Roux rarely left the plantation house at night, unless he was drunk. She said Gerard had no reason to patrol near the barns at midnight. She said their focus must be Baptiste. She looked at each member carefully, making sure they understood. She reminded them that danger would be everywhere. She told them that if anything went wrong, they must run into the cane fields and let the wind hide them. The group nodded, fear and determination mixing in their eyes. Zabeth placed her hand on the ground again and whispered a short prayer to the spirits of the land. Then she signaled them to move. The night was unusually quiet for such a humid evening. The frogs that usually croaked near the river were silent. The crickets were still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Zabeth led her group toward the barns with slow, careful steps. They stayed low in the tall grass, crawling like shadows. When they reached the back of the barn, they paused. Zabeth looked at the lantern flickering weakly near the door. She knew Baptiste would arrive soon. Joachim slipped around to the corner and positioned himself behind a pile of wooden crates. Marcel and Etienne crouched behind a broken cart. Adeline hid near the fence, watching both paths. Zabeth stood slightly apart from the others, her eyes fixed on the path Baptiste always walked. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Then the sound of footsteps echoed across the dirt. Baptiste entered the area, holding his usual lantern. He muttered to himself, stumbling slightly. He set his lantern down and leaned against the barn wall, stretching his neck as he always did. Zabeth signaled Joachim. Joachim picked up a small stone and threw it against the wooden crates beside him. Baptiste jerked his head up, startled. He grabbed his whip and stepped cautiously toward the sound. He moved exactly as Zabeth predicted, exactly as he had every night for years. When he reached the corner of the barn, Marcel and Etienne rose from behind the cart in one swift motion. Baptiste barely had time to lift his whip before Etienne struck him in the knee, making him stumble. Marcel grabbed his arm. Baptiste tried to shout, but Zabeth rushed forward and covered his mouth with her hand. His eyes widened in shock as he stared at the woman he had tormented for so long. Zabeth looked at him without fear. She whispered that the cane field had waited for this moment longer than he knew. Baptiste tried to pull away, but Etienne and Marcel held him down. Zabeth raised a heavy wooden beam that lay on the ground. She looked into Baptiste's eyes one last time. She saw confusion. She saw anger. Then she saw fear. She brought the beam down with all the strength she had stored for many years. The blow was powerful. Baptiste collapsed onto the dirt, his body shaking before going still. Zabeth remained standing over him, breathing hard. The group stayed frozen for several seconds, shocked by the speed and force of what had happened. Adeline trembled where she stood. Joachim stared at the ground. Etienne placed a hand on Zabeth's shoulder, calling her name softly. Zabeth dropped the beam and stepped back. She looked at the overseer on the ground. She expected to feel relief, but she felt something deeper. She felt the weight of every beating her people had suffered. She felt the voices of every forgotten soul rising within her. She felt the cane fields whisper louder than ever before. For a moment, she feared her legs would give out, but she steadied herself. She told the group that they must move quickly. They dragged Baptiste's body behind the barn and covered it with cane leaves and mud. Zabeth instructed them to return to their huts separately. She warned them not to speak to anyone. She said that tomorrow would be dangerous, because the overseers would investigate the disappearance. She said they must act natural and calm. The group nodded. One by one, they slipped into the darkness, leaving Zabeth alone for a moment. She looked up at the sky and whispered that the first strike had been delivered. She whispered that justice had begun. Then she returned to her hut with steady steps, knowing that the real storm was still coming. Morning rose with a strange stillness across La Grande Savane. The cane fields moved gently under the sunlight, but the air carried a heavy silence that pressed against the skin like invisible hands. Zabeth stepped out of her hut with careful movements, hiding the trembling in her hands by clenching them into fists at her sides. She had barely slept, though her body felt charged with nervous energy. Today would be the aftermath. Today, the overseers would notice Baptiste was gone. Today, she and her group had to perform with perfect calmness, or suspicion would fall like a hammer. As she joined the other enslaved people walking toward the fields, she kept her eyes low. Her brother Etienne limped ahead of her, trying to look as tired and slow as he always did. Marcel walked with his usual heavy steps, hiding the fear deep inside him. Adeline stood quietly at the back, her face blank. Joachim kept his eyes fixed on the ground. They were all acting, each one masking the memory of last night when Baptiste fell beneath Zabeth's blow. When they reached the open area near the barns, Zabeth felt her stomach knot tightly. Gerard stood in the center of the path, with his arms crossed. Rue stood beside him, looking angrier than usual. They whispered to each other before Gerard motioned for the workers to line up. Zabeth joined the line and kept her face still. Gerard walked slowly in front of them, his eyes sharp as blades. He studied each person carefully. When he reached Zabeth, he paused. She felt the weight of his gaze, like a hot stone pressing into her chest. She kept her eyes on the ground. Gerard stepped closer. He asked her a simple question. He asked if she had seen Baptiste last night. Zabeth felt her breath catch for a moment before she answered. She said softly that she had been asleep because the storm had made her tired. She said she knew nothing about Baptiste. Gerard studied her for another long moment, then moved on. But the look in his eyes lingered in her mind like a warning. Work began, but the overseers were restless. Rue paced up and down the rows of cane, his face red with frustration. He kept muttering to himself that Baptiste must be drunk somewhere, or wandering aimlessly after the storm. Gerard did not share this belief. He looked disturbed. He ordered several workers to search near the barns, but they found nothing. Zabeth knew they would not find the body because she and her group had hidden it deep behind the second barn under mud and cane leaves. Still, she feared the wind might shift or animals might disturb the ground. She worked with steady hands, slicing cane stalks with practiced rhythm, while her ears stayed alert for any sign of trouble. At midday, Rue ordered the workers to stop and gather for a head count. He announced loudly that Baptiste was missing. His voice shook with a mixture of anger and fear. Rue was cruel, but even he knew that the disappearance of an overseer could cause panic among plantation owners. He threatened everyone, shouting that if anyone knew something and kept silent, he would beat them until they could no longer stand. His eyes flashed with fury. Gerard stepped forward and spoke quietly, but firmly, telling Rue that shouting at frightened workers would not bring Baptiste back. Rue glared at him, but did not argue. Gerard turned to the workers and told them that they were free to speak if they noticed anything strange last night. No one spoke. Zabeth kept her head low. Etienne stood still. Marcel breathed slowly through his nose, refusing to lift his eyes. Adeline prayed silently. Joachim kept wiping sweat from his forehead, though the heat was not extreme. The group stayed calm, but Zabeth felt a sense of danger rising in the air. She noticed that Gerard kept looking toward the barns, as if the ground itself spoke to him. He walked toward the barns several times, studying the dirt and the crates. Zabeth watched him carefully. He was not like Baptiste or Rue. He was observant, calculating, patient. He had the mind of a man who did not trust what he could not see. Zabeth realized that Gerard would not stop searching until he found answers, and that made him their greatest threat. When evening came and the workers returned to their huts, Zabeth gathered her group behind the mango tree once again. The sky above them was cloudy, yet patches of faded sunlight still spilled across the ground. The group sat in a tight circle, their voices low, their expressions tense. Marcel was the first to speak. He said he feared Gerard would find Baptiste's body soon, because Gerard kept inspecting the barns. Adeline said she felt sick all day, convinced Gerard knew something. Joachim said he feared someone in the camp might talk out of fear. Etienne said Gerard appeared too smart for them to deal with easily. Zabeth listened to every concern with a calm expression, but inside she felt the pressure mounting. She told them that they needed to move Baptiste's body before Gerard found it. She said the storm had softened the ground around the barns, making it dangerous to leave any trace. Marcel asked how they would move the body without being seen. Zabeth explained that they would wait until the deepest part of the night, when the overseers fell into heavy sleep. She said they would carry the body into the cane fields and bury it beneath thick roots where no one would search. She also said they must stay alert, because Gerard's suspicion would not disappear easily. She reminded them that killing Baptiste was only the first step. She told them Roux would be next, because his cruelty stretched across too many years. She said Gerard would be last because he was the most dangerous. Etienne placed a hand on her knee and whispered that they must be careful. Zabeth nodded slowly. She said she felt the spirit stirring again, warning her that danger was near, but also encouraging her to push forward. She reassured the group that they were stronger than their fear. She told them that fear arose from uncertainty, but their purpose was clear. With slow nods and heavy breaths, the group agreed to meet again when night fell completely. Night eventually wrapped the plantation in darkness. The workers' huts glowed with faint candlelight before going dark one by one. The overseers remained awake longer than usual, discussing Baptiste's disappearance. Zabeth waited inside her hut with Etienne, listening to their muffled voices drifting through the walls of the plantation house. She heard Roux shouting about runaway slaves, and she heard Gerard answering with calm logic, insisting that Baptiste would not wander far. She heard the two men argue, until finally their voices faded with fatigue. When the night grew silent, Zabeth stood slowly. She touched her brother's shoulder and told him it was time. They stepped outside and moved quietly toward the mango tree. Marcel, Adeline, and Joachim waited there, their faces pale but determined. Together, they crept through the thick grass toward the barns. The moon hung low behind clouds, offering little light. The air smelled of wet soil from the storm. They reached the place behind the barn where Baptiste's body had been hidden. Zabeth knelt beside the pile of mud and cane leaves. She dug with her hands until she felt the cloth of Baptiste's shirt. The group worked silently, pulling the body from the earth. Baptiste's face was twisted in the same expression of fear he had worn in his final moment. Zabeth looked at him without emotion. She whispered that his cruelty had ended, and that the earth would now swallow his memory. Together, they lifted the body and carried it toward the cane fields, struggling through the mud. The night was still, but every sound felt loud. Zabeth kept listening for footsteps. When they reached a deep cluster of cane, she stopped. She told the group this was the place. They dug a shallow grave with their hands, burying Baptiste beneath a thick patch of roots and covering him with layers of soil and leaves. When they finished, Zabeth smoothed the ground with her palms. She whispered a final word to the earth, asking it to hide the overseer from all searching eyes. As the group prepared to return to their huts, Zabeth felt something shift in the wind. It was sharp and cool, like a warning touch. She paused. She listened. Somewhere near the barns, she heard a sound, a faint crack of wood, a boot scraping softly against the ground. She froze. She signaled for the group to drop to the ground. They pressed themselves into the earth and listened. The sound grew clearer. Someone was walking. Someone was close. Zabeth held her breath. She knew immediately who it was. She recognized the rhythm of the footsteps. Gerard. He was patrolling the barns at night. Something had brought him outside. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps uneasiness. Perhaps a suspicion that refused to leave his mind. Zabeth saw a shadow pass near the barn wall, long and thin under the faint moonlight. Gerard paused, staring into the darkness as if trying to see what hid inside. Zabeth pressed her hands into the earth, praying he would turn away. After what felt like a long eternity, Gerard finally exhaled, turned his back, and walked toward the plantation house. The sound of his footsteps faded slowly. Only then did Zabeth and her group rise quietly. They returned to their huts separately, each one silent, each breath heavy, each heart beating hard. Zabeth slipped inside her hut and closed her eyes. She knew their path had become far more dangerous. Gerard was closer to discovering the truth than they had expected. She knew now that the next steps must be taken with even greater care. She whispered softly into the darkness that the cane fields had protected and saw them once again. She whispered that the spirits still walked beside her. But she also whispered that the true battle had only begun. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness, as if the island itself waited for something to happen. The air felt thicker. The clouds gathered silently above the plantation house. Even the animals seemed restless. Zabeth felt it immediately as she stepped out of her hut. She sensed a tension pressing down from the sky like a giant hand. She tried to keep her expression calm as she joined the others walking toward the cane fields. Her heart beat in slow, deep thumps against her ribs. She could feel the weight of the previous night still clinging to her skin. They had buried Baptiste, but the danger had not been buried with him. The danger had only changed shape. It had taken the form of Gerard, whose suspicion grew sharper each hour. Zabeth noticed him standing near the barns when they reached the worksite. He stared at the ground with narrowed eyes. He moved slowly, studying every footprint, every patch of dirt, every disturbed leaf. Rue paced back and forth angrily, shouting at anyone who moved too slowly. Zabeth kept her eyes down, but she felt Gerard's gaze sweep across the workers. He paused briefly when his eyes reached her. She felt his stare pressing against her skin like heat. She inhaled slowly and focused on the cane stalks before her. Her group worked near her, each trying to appear normal. Marcel wiped sweat from his brow. Adeline kept her hands steady even though they trembled. Joachim worked with a quiet desperation. Etienne struggled with his limp, moving as slowly as always, so no one would question his condition. Zabeth tried to calm her breathing as she sliced the cane with practiced motions. She kept listening to every sound around her. She needed to hear what Gerard planned. She needed to understand what he saw. Later in the morning, Rue shouted for everyone to gather in an open space between the cane rows. The workers stood silently as he paced angrily, waving his arms and shouting that Baptiste could not simply vanish. He accused the workers of hiding information. He threatened that if they did not speak soon, he would punish dozens at once. His face twisted red with fury. The workers bowed their heads, knowing that speaking would endanger them all. Gerard stepped forward and raised a hand. Roux fell silent. Gerard spoke quietly. He said he believed Baptiste had not run away or wandered off. He said something must have happened to him. He said he had searched the barns, the storage areas, and parts of the cane fields. He said he did not trust the silence of the workers. His voice carried no anger, only cold certainty. Zabeth felt her stomach tighten. Gerard then announced that every worker would undergo questioning that evening. His eyes scanned their faces, looking for fear. Zabeth kept her expression as still as stone. She felt her group shifting uneasily beside her. Etienne looked toward the ground. Marcel clenched his fists. Adeline blinked rapidly, trying to appear calm. Joachim kept swallowing nervously. Gerard watched all of them carefully. He was like a hunter, studying the movement of prey. Zabeth understood then that Gerard was more dangerous than Roux and Baptiste combined. He did not rely on anger or power. He relied on observation and patience. He looked for patterns. He searched for lies hidden in faces. He listened to silence as if it carried meaning. Zabeth realized that if she did not act soon, Gerard would uncover the truth. And if that happened, not only would her group die, but every worker on the plantation would suffer punishment. That night, the workers returned to their huts in silence. Tension spread across the camp like a sickness. Even those who knew nothing felt the danger. Parents told their children to stay quiet. Old men sat outside their huts, muttering prayers. Zabeth gathered her group once again behind the mango tree. The night air felt colder than usual. Even the insects seemed quieter. Marcel whispered that Gerard was becoming too suspicious. Adeline said she felt certain Gerard had seen them near the barns. Joachim said he feared Gerard would question the workers separately, and someone might break under pressure. Etienne said they had no choice but to act before Gerard uncovered the truth. Zabeth listened to each concern, while keeping her eyes fixed on the dark hills beyond the cane fields. She felt the wind touch her face gently. She felt the spirits pressing against her heart, urging her to think clearly. She understood what needed to be done, though the idea frightened her deeply. She turned to her group and spoke quietly. She said Gerard must be stopped before he discovered the body or connected the clues. She said he was too observant. She said he was too focused. She said if they waited, he would uncover something. She also said that Gerard would not confront them openly. He would stalk them quietly, waiting for a crack in their silence. Marcel asked how they could deal with Gerard when he watched the workers so closely. Zabeth said they would not confront him in the open. She said the time to strike Gerard would come, but not tonight. She said tonight they needed to prepare for his questioning. She told them to stay calm, no matter what he asked. She told them to keep their answers simple. She told them to avoid giving extra information. She reminded them that Gerard looked for hesitation. She warned them that fear could betray them. She said they must hide their fear deep inside their hearts. The group nodded slowly. Zabeth placed her hand on the earth and whispered to the spirits for clarity. When she stood, her decision was firm. She said that tomorrow they would begin planning how to deal with Gerard, but tonight they must protect themselves with silence. As the night deepened, Zabeth returned to her hut and sat near the doorway while Etienne tried to sleep. She listened to the quiet sounds of the camp. She listened to the distant movement of guards near the plantation house. She listened to her own heartbeat, slow and heavy. She whispered to herself that she must stay strong. She whispered that she could not let Gerard ruin everything they had done. She whispered that justice had only begun. She whispered that Rue also had to face punishment soon. She whispered that the spirits were still with her. Then she felt something strange. A sudden coldness in the wind. A faint soft sound, like a cane leaf brushing against another. A sense of warning. She stood slowly and looked outside. The sky was dark. The clouds drifted lazily across the moon. The cane fields moved in gentle waves, but something felt wrong. She stepped outside quietly, moving barefoot on the soft earth. She walked toward the edge of the huts. She stopped when she saw a faint movement near the barns, a quiet shadow walking slowly, a tall figure. She knew immediately who it was, Gerard. He walked softly, almost gliding across the ground. He paused near the second barn. He studied the ground with the lantern he held. He knelt and touched the soil. He stood up again. He walked slowly along the edge of the barn. Zabeth watched him carefully, hidden in darkness. She realized Gerard was close to discovering